it's a tense moment. Why? It's because now it's beginning to be serious. Countries have to find some compromise. And of course, at the last moment, the 6 next months, to find them. And because we, as a French presidency, we would like to accelerate the movement, not to be to have a big surprise in Paris because we are not prepared. So we try to have the main elements of the agreement on the table by October. So that creates a pressure. That's, of course, the logical result of this is countries are, of course, beginning to be tougher because they don't want to let their cards already. And that is what really will happen during this summer, to try to convince countries that it is a moment now to really pass and agree on the compromise. So I'm confident because every country wants to achieve by Paris. They don't want to wait another year. They want really to have a strong agreement. Of course, the nuances and the position are still very, very diverse. And so it's very difficult to align everybody. And there are strong views from the different groups. But I'm confident because countries want to really agree in Paris and not to pursue again and again the negotiation. The second element is that the countries are much more prepared than they were before Copenhagen. Most of the big countries of the G20, all of them, have implemented or tried to implement climate policy. So they know about the issues. They know what to do, even if it's difficult. They are struggling, of course, but they know what it is about. It was not the case in Copenhagen. And finally, the engagement of businesses is very impressive. Again, before Copenhagen, they were there, but it was a minority. It's not altogether a majority, but there is now a very strong movement. Even the companies who were resisting now are proposing to be part of the process. So that's why I'm confident. But really, we have a lot to do now, these 6 months.
You mentioned the negotiations. Currently there is an 84-page text, which probably if you dropped it on someone, it might kill them. And on the other hand, you have the 4 pillars of this agreement, which you and Foreign Minister Fabius have talked a lot about. And they seem very simple and straightforward. How do you bring those two together? Because on the one hand, you have tortuous negotiations, and on the other, you have a fairly simple clear framework and vision. Where do they meet?
That's of course a trick. The one, of course, the text is about the agreement, and he has to in a way to fit with the global picture we are trying to develop with Minister Fabius. So, of course, the complexity of the text means that we have to get a much simpler text by June, or at the latest by end of August, to be able to work with it. If this not proceed from the normal process, of course, that will rely on the French presidency in the COP in December to produce a new document. So we don't want that. So we would push and press everybody to deliver by the end of August this new text, much shorter, really defining what has to be decided in Paris, what should be decided afterwards, and what is really the core principle which should be in the agreement. But then we are beginning to explain, and that is taking shape, that the agreement is something, but we need a much broader signal to the real economy that the agreement will not be by itself develop and implement, because we need the behaviors, we need the anticipation or the expectation of actors. That's why we have this financial package, we have the solution agenda, and of course we push the countries to make the more ambitious contribution possible. And it begins to be understood from the negotiators' point of view that Paris outcome has to involve the local authorities and the businesses, which is basically the solution agenda behind this. And the financial package, we gathered a lot of energy from the institutional investors, from the international institution, financial institution. You have now IMF and World Bank and the regional multilateral banks behind this. And we have the private sector, the private banking. And that is to be explained to the government that this is really a resource. They can and they will have access to cheap capital to finance their long-term transition. And of course there is this short-term money that before 2020 we have to deliver. So it's still a diplomatic effort to make everybody feel that we should concentrate, of course, on getting an agreement right, but we have the broader perspective because we have to communicate not only between negotiators, but with a real economy. And I think now more and more people and government understand that. Many governments are happy that companies will participate, or local authorities, if of course managing the delicate relationship between the subnational levels and the central government levels. But I'm very optimistic on this innovation. It's really taking shape now.
You talked about subnational governments, and there are plenty of examples. Perhaps the best one is Canada, where the provinces seem to be moving faster than the federal government, and that seems to be a policy that you have, the French team, has actively pursued. Is that to try and not subvert national governments, but to try and depoliticise this and work with subnational governments which perhaps do not have the same political baggage as the main national bodies?
I think in a way it's exactly depoliticizing, meaning it's not an ideological question, it's an economic policy question. And the problem is the governments have to feel comfortable that they can do that. They can really have this low carbon economy. And the way to do that is they have support to do this. For example, now the White House has understood that having the businesses and the local authority from US supporting the policy would help the Obama administration. And in Canada, it's more or less the same. Some provinces want to go further and move ahead. And this is not in contradiction. Of course, it's a tension between the different provinces. But I think that Canada can then have a better position, that I think will be the case, because they feel that they are supported by at least some other interest. And that is really, it's about political economy. We have to create the coalitions behind the governments. And that is not politicized, it's at the contrary, just making government confident that they can do it. They will be supported, and the vested interest, the opposition will be lower and with less intensity. So it's not to subvert, of course that would be stupid, because then we will have a strong reaction. It's at the contrary, to explain if these countries or this city can do that, and that will help a lot of you look to really to gain your reputation, to help the collective action. And finally, that you can do that finally, because this city or these provinces, or if California can deliver so much on renewable energy, it gives an example for everybody. And finally, governments are more central decisions, but local authorities can explain on the ground how they do that. And that is very important as an example as well.
One of the issues here that's being talked about is a price on carbon. It was something that President Laurence talked about last week at the Climate and Business Summit. But you hear a lot of companies saying we need a price on carbon, but the governments don't seem to follow it. And fine, we have a European Union trading system, and China's moving, but there are about 40 governments, aren't there, around the world which have got carbon prices, and that leaves quite a few, about 150, without it. So why do you think that is? Who's blocking this?
Oh, first, that the economic consequences, the distributive consequences, and of putting a price on carbon, and second, the problem of competitiveness of the industry. So that's very important. That now we are in the middle of a reform of the EU ETS, and that's very important that the companies who are supporting having a carbon price support the reform. That would be a very good reality check, no? And I think that's why government are not sure they will be supported, and there will be enormous obstacle against that, and they don't know how really to manage this opposition. But at the same time, when you look at G20 countries, in a form or another, take even India, which has certificates of renewable energy and energy efficiency, or of course China will be the case, or many others, they experiment some form of carbon pricing. But again, carbon pricing is not everything. The government has to do urban planning, they have to develop technology on clean transport, so they have to do an ensemble of things that make the carbon pricing effective. If you don't have solution to move from private car to public transport, even if you could put a very high price on the fuel or carbon tax on the fuel, people cannot move and find a solution. So you have to offer the infrastructure or the alternatives, and that's the same for energy efficiency. You can put a carbon price for heating, for example, but if you don't offer the solution in terms of credit and materials and whatever, people will not do that. So that, I think, is the process we are in. We need a broad portfolio of policies to make the carbon pricing efficient, and that's probably the complexity of these policies, because they are very cross-sectoral.
One last question. Many developing countries say they're still concerned that Paris on its own will not hit the 2-degree warming target, beyond which scientists say there'll be more floods, droughts, rising sea levels. How hard is France willing to fight for those poorer countries which don't really have much diplomatic clout and could easily be pushed aside by an alliance of the G20 saying this is how it's going to work? How hard are you willing to fight for those poorer countries which don't offer you the same political capital but will be on the front line of any future disasters?
I think, in my view, in the view of Minister Fabius, is really the responsibility of the presidency to make sure that the ones who have no voice have a voice. That's, I think, a major responsibility. So we should not allow an agreement that put the African countries or the LDCs, the Bangladesh of this world aside. So that's very important. The second is, yes, probably all the contributions that are prepared will not make it for the 2 C trajectory now. But when you look at them carefully, they are already much more ambitious than what countries commit to in Cancun by 2020. So we have a movement there. So the process is really to accelerate that and to get in the agreement, which is very difficult, close the rendezvous where countries would update and upgrade their contribution over time. So that's very important. And finally, we have to prepare special packages for less developed countries and the more affected ones. That's why adaptation has to be treated as equal parity as mitigation in the agreement. And it's very new. We don't know exactly how to do that. It's a problem of ODA, of special programs, of innovation as well. But it is really a challenge we have to respond to.